Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Insight with Beyond the Headlines and Political Tours. Our guest today is Kasra Naji, a special correspondent with the BBC's Persian service. Kasra grew up in Iran, but was partly educated in the UK. As well as working for the BBC, he's reported for The Economist, The Guardian, and the Financial Times. Hello, Kasra. Welcome to Insight.
Hello, Nicholas. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be an opportunity for us to get some up-to-date analysis on what's going on in Iran today, but also, I hope, to get a broader understanding of Iranian politics and society. We've got a full hour ahead of us, so there's plenty of time to discuss things. If you've got questions, everyone, please do put your questions in the Q&A box below us, just down here. Just keep putting those questions as we go along. And do stay on for the end of the hour when we've got about 10 or 15 minutes or so after Kasra has gone, where we just have a chat among ourselves and it's your turn to share your thoughts about what we've been talking about. Kasra, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's a real pleasure. I know quite a bit about you and I've really been looking forward to this. Can we start with how you became a journalist in Iran, and then also say what it was like to be a reporter in Iran after the revolution? Kasra.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining in. To answer your question, it goes back to 40 years ago almost. In the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, I was a student abroad. I was in New York. I was studying political economy at a university in New York called the New School for Social Research. The revolution happened. I thought it was a very good thing. I wanted to be part of it. Little did I knew that how it would turn out in the end. But I desperately wanted to be in Iran and part of it. So I caught back on my studies. I left it basically and went back to Iran. And soon in Iran, through a friend, I found my first job back in Iran translating for journalists who were coming to Iran to report on the revolution. I worked with some of the most senior, best Western journalists at the time, and this is how I started with with journalism. I always wanted to be a journalist, but that was a very good way into it, in a sense that I worked with really fantastic journalists from Le Monde, from New York Times, from The Guardian, Financial Times, BBC, you name it. I worked with a whole lot. So it was a very interesting time in Iran. Being a journalist in the midst of a revolution was the most exciting thing you could possibly do at the time. So it worked very well for a few years. I worked there till, it was 1979, the revolution. I worked till 84. By then, the Iranian authorities sort of grew to dislike me. Did
you have to do military service? Because obviously the war had broken out in 1980 and men, mostly young men your age, would have been drafted into military service, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I was overeducated for that. At the time, the revolutionaries didn't want anybody above a degree, a university degree, to be in the army. They thought maybe this is not a good idea to have people there. So no, I was exempted. So I had no problems on that front. But the authorities did sort of take a dislike to me. They didn't like the stuff that journalists were producing with my help at the time. I was fixing for them, translating for them, interpreting for them. So
you weren't doing so much writing as more sort of facilitating the work with foreign journalists.
Yes, absolutely. But nevertheless, I needed a press card to be able to operate, and they refused to issue that. So after 6 months, I decided it's no good. I left. I went back to London this time. I started a degree in journalism at the City University here. And then I joined the BBC. I joined the BBC Persian radio at the time, part of the BBC World Service. I worked there for about 5 or 6 years. And then I resigned to go and be a journalist abroad. I wanted to be a roving correspondent, foreign correspondent. So I went to Afghanistan, I went to Central Asia, I went to Asia, and freelancing. And then I started work with CNN. I worked with CNN as a correspondent for them in Asia for 5 or 6 years. And then in 2003, my wife, who's English and working for the BBC, was appointed as BBC correspondent in Tehran. So we both went back to Iran, as I thought they would allow me to work for CNN while she's working for BBC, but they didn't. So I had a lot of time on my hand while my wife was working. So I wrote my book, the book that was at the time the president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. I wrote a biography of him while I was in Iran.
I want to talk to you in a second about what came after the biography, but just to start with, once you produced the biography, things became very difficult for you and your family, didn't it? From that point onwards, really, because you've been going back and forth to Iran, seeing your family before that point, but at that point, then it becomes very difficult.
It wasn't to do with the book so much as working with the BBC. Once in 2007, when my wife's tenure as BBC correspondent ended, we both left Iran. We came back to London. And then my book came out around the same time. But the book wasn't the issue. What was the issue is that when I went back to London, I joined the BBC Persian television. This time the BBC Persian had become a television and had just begun to work as a television station. And I thought it was a very good thing to do because in Iran, I tell you, when we were in Iran, I noticed that a lot of people don't speak English. And if you don't speak English, you tend to not quite understand where you are vis-a-vis the rest of the world, what is happening to your country, to yourself, all that, because you are you don't have enough information, given the fact that there's quite a sort of a extensive censorship in Iran going on. So when the BBC Persian television sort of came about, I thought it was a good thing to join it because I thought it was a very useful thing to do for the Iranians. But Iranians took a very negative view of the BBC Persian television. Television is very powerful. It's a lot more powerful than radio is. In a sense. With the radio, the Iranian authorities weren't so excited or sensitive, if you like. But with television, they became very sensitive. They started a whole campaign of harassment against us in the BBC Persian almost immediately. I tell you, the beginning of that period was coincided with the Green Revolution at the time, Green Movement, if you remember. That was when President Ahmadinejad sought a second term in office. He nearly lost it. They had to cheat to win the elections. And when they cheated, people came out on the streets and protested. The protests went on for months. So at that time, suddenly they accused us, the BBC and the West, and all sorts of Western countries and others, of meddling in their revolution, in their elections. So we suddenly became enemies of the Iranian government.
And it was at that time that they started imposing financial, both restricting your access to finances and also your family as well in Iran as well.
Yes, but it didn't start with that. It started at a low level, and in 2009, 2010, 11, 12, 13. And 2017, suddenly they raised the bar. They raised the bar in the sense that the harassment and persecution got very serious. There were cases of persecution of our family members in Iran, harassment of our people here in London.
And what form did that harassment take? I mean, what kind of harassment was that?
I will tell you. In 2007, when they raised the bar, they issued a list of 150 of us, accusing us of conspiracy against national security, and then put a freeze on our assets in Iran, and basically starting a legal process against each and every one of us. But with that came a stepped up level of harassment. One case, probably the worst case, was we have a producer, a young woman whose sister in Tehran was arrested one night when the security forces raided her father's house in Tehran. They arrested this 20-year-old woman. They took her. They didn't tell the family where they're taking her. 3 days later, my colleague here in London gets a message from her sister in Tehran saying that, I am in Evin prison in Iran, and we have people who want to talk to you. So they establish a Skype contact with the interrogators of this 20-year-old woman. And then interrogators say basically to our colleague that she must leave the BBC, or at least spy on the BBC Persian for Iran if she wants her sister released. She obviously says, listen, I cannot help you. I cannot do this. I cannot agree to this. And then they hold the sister for a few days, and then they released her after 20 days, I think. That was one case, but there are many other cases of parents, elderly parents, being taken in the middle of the night for interrogation. People here, my colleagues, being threatened. We have a presenter, a young woman, who received emails saying that we know where your son goes to school, be careful, you have to leave the BBC. There was another case of elderly mother in Tehran being taken for interrogation and then being told that, your son in London can easily go under a bus, these things happen in London, that kind of thing. And then also the very people here at this end getting threatened. We had 2 or 3 cases whereby we reported to the police, and the police, we had anti-terrorist police protection for a couple of them for a while. And that has been going on, and we have started a campaign. The BBC doesn't do campaigns, but nevertheless, we pushed for it. We got the BBC top management people to agree to employ top lawyers for us to push a campaign. But the Iranians don't seem to be taking any notice, although the harassment of family members has stopped in the last few months. In the last 2 or 3 months, I haven't heard any cases of particular harassment, but these things go up and down. Like, if there's trouble on the streets of Tehran, then we can be sure that our family members are going to be in the front line.
And of course, you can't go back to Tehran. And I think your father died in 2012 and you wanted to go back, but you knew it was going to be too risky.
Yeah, I mean, this is the case for not just me, for the rest of us in the BBC Persian. None of us can go back to Iran these days. And that's pretty sort of awful for many of us who have elderly parents. Yeah. Almost 30-40% of us, about 30-40 people, have lost parents and were not able to go to Iran to be with them in their last days. So that's a
heavy price,
pressure on all of us.
Yeah, I think we're quite keen to know what's going on in Iran at the moment. Yeah. Talk about COVID, but before we get there, I just want to take you back a step, and I think this is very important. In your book in 2008 on Ahmadinejad, you spoke about a sort of an internal revolution, if you like, a new takeover with a young group of clerics who were opposed to a reform taking over the government. And Ahmadinejad represented part of that sort of new movement, the sort of young Turks, if you like, for want of a better phrase. They were also determined to export Iran's revolution throughout the Middle East. And looking back now, 12 years later, who won that struggle? Did they win or the reformers? I know that's a bit of a black and white question, but I want to try and get an idea of what happened in that struggle between those two opposing blocs. The old guard, who I think wanted some kind of economic reform because they recognized Iran was struggling, and the people who really wanted to stick to a hard line, the right wingers, if you like.
Ahmadinejad represented the hardliners when he came to power. And it was the first time that the hardliners have almost all the three branches of government under their wing. They had the Speaker of Parliament, they had the President, they had the Chief of the Judiciary, and of course they had the backing of the Iran's Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So it was the first time that they were in complete control. And it was, in a sense, that it was new in a sense that the Iranian hardliners could do whatever they wanted to without any pressure from the reformists, from the moderates, or anybody. And that, as I said earlier on, in the first term of office, first 4 years of Ahmadinejad, it went like that, and Iran got into serious trouble under Ahmadinejad, particularly with the nuclear program, and Iran started coming under international sanctions, isolation, and you name it. And when he sought to come to power for the second time, as I said earlier, they had to cheat basically to get him into power. And then the next 4 years, it was again more or less the same thing. But when
then you have that rapprochement with the United States and the agreement, the JPOAC, and that Obama goes and Trump comes back in, and that brings us to where we are now. So I guess I'm trying to. We sort of know what happened in that. There was a sense of hope, a possibility that Iran could begin or the world could engage with Iran, and vice versa. But what's the situation now? Who has the upper hand?
Ahmadinejad is gone. We've got President Rouhani, who's a centrist, really, but in power. He has been under the pressure of hardliners. All the policies are basically very hardline. So, in a sense, to answer your earlier question, the ascent of the hardliners in Iran, although became slower, but nevertheless continued under President Rouhani. President Rouhani managed to get a nuclear deal with 6 world powers. That didn't last long. It didn't quite work to begin with because Iran was under heavy sanctions, and lifting of all those sanctions didn't quite work because of banking issues and stuff. And then we had Donald Trump coming to power, wanting to tear out that particular nuclear agreement, which he did, in fact. In a sense, he pulled out of that agreement. And today where we are is that the Americans are putting what they call maximum pressure on Iran to isolate Iran, to force Iran to come to the negotiating table so that they can get a better deal, they say. But there is no indication that that policy is working. Iranians, although are poorer and poorer and poorer by the day under massive US and international sanctions now, secondary American sanctions. But nevertheless, I don't see any sign of them coming soon to a negotiating table with the Americans. And I get the impression that this policy is more or less now is somewhat geared towards the American internal sort of issues and politics, and particularly the elections. So they want to keep the pressure on Iran until at least the elections, and then they will, I suppose, reassess where they are vis-a-vis Iran.
Yeah. Just to address everyone who's listening, and this is a really good time just to start coming in with questions. So please do write your questions in that Q&A slot below. We're going to talk now to Kasra about what's happening in Iran at the moment. We touched upon the economy, but I also want to know about what's happening with COVID. So just as we're talking, please do start writing questions, and then we'll turn to you and turn your microphones on. Kasra, so what is happening now? Iran got a lot of criticism for being seen to not handle the virus very well. A sort of large number of cases arising, hospitals apparently being overwhelmed, but then introducing lockdown. What's happened since? What's going on at the moment?
We are at the height of the second, what looks like the height of the second wave of COVID in Iran. The Iranians managed to bring down the number of new cases, the number of daily deaths, somehow by introducing lockdown and social distancing, all that. But then as soon as they lifted it in early May, the first few days of May, they lifted a lot of the restrictions. They opened up businesses and shopping centers. And then it started going up again. The mosques started to open, shrines opened, all sorts of places sort of came up. As they did, the number of new cases went up with it, and the number of daily deaths went up again. So we are back to where we were at the peak of the coronavirus crisis in terms of numbers of 3 months ago. So
do we know how many people actually have died so far? Is it? I mean, there was a lot of criticism about the figures, and there was also film of outdoor morgues and some fairly grim stuff.
I think
What's your assessment of things?
I think the number is about 11,000 deaths so far, and the numbers are a bit sort of unreliable in the sense that few people believe those numbers, and the indications we have is that the real numbers of coronavirus deaths are probably 5 times what they say. But nevertheless, what the Iranians are giving as numbers is an indication of up and down of this coronavirus crisis. And those numbers themselves show that we are back up again. The indications are probably that we are talking about 5 times more deaths, 5 times more coronavirus new cases on a daily basis.
Okay, well let's bring in some people to ask some questions. I think we've got Marty, who's up there. If we can bring Marty Ryan in, and also if we could take in Pamela Dixon. There's an anonymous attendee who's got a question, and I'll ask a question on their behalf. But Marty, you go ahead. Marty, ask your question.
I'm here. Salam, Kasri.
Salam.
And I have 2 unrelated questions.
Tell me.
One is, first of all, my best travels ever were to Iran 5 years ago. I absolutely loved my experience in your country. So, but
Where are you sitting, by the way? Where are you from?
I'm in the United States. I'm in Connecticut.
Right.
And I have 2 questions that are really unrelated. One is, do you know anything about the fire that just happened on Thursday at a nuclear site?
Do I know much about it? I know what's been said officially, and I've seen reports and what experts have been saying, few of them who have been speaking. And the Iranians, the latest thing from the Iranian officials is that they have investigated it. This was a fire or some explosion in Natanz nuclear facility. This is the most sensitive nuclear facility in Iran. It's an enrichment plant. And today, as we speak, they are enriching uranium there up to 5% enrichment. It happened there the night before, and the Iranians are saying that they have investigated all the various plausible explanations for the explosion, and they have identified the cause of it, but they're not going to say what it was because of what they say is security considerations for the moment, but they're saying that they will announce it and make it public in due course. The night before, last night, in fact, the same people who were issuing this statement today were saying that if there are indications that either Israel or the United States were behind this, then Iran will have to respond and change its defensive strategy, as they put it, accordingly. What that means is, I don't know, I suppose they mean that we have to be on the offensive with Israelis or something to that effect. But for the moment, obviously, this wasn't just an accident. It must have been some kind of an attack. What kind of an attack? I have no idea. It could be either a cyber attack of some sort that had physical consequences leading to some kind of explosion, or it was a straightforward attack either by a drone or a military aircraft. Israelis do have these F-35 planes, and these F-35 planes are they're not easy to be spotted with your normal radars. So I presume Israelis could come so far as middle of Iran to do this and go back. But I mean, these are all speculations. I have no idea. Okay. What we know is that this has been more than an accident.
Okay, Marty, we're going to take your second question in a moment. You just stay on the line there because we've got some other people who are lining up too. So let Pamela Dixon, can you got a question, and then we'll take Diane Cook straight after that. So Pamela first.
Okay, hello, Nicholas, Mr. Naji, nice to hear you today. I'm speaking from Miami, Florida, in the States. My question is, what do you make of the arrest warrants, for Donald Trump and the 35 others for the killing of Soleimani? What is the greater significance of that? Is there a long-term tactical goal in issuing these arrest warrants at this time?
I think mostly is aimed at the internal market, the Iranians, for the Iranians. The regime, the leaders in Iran, they want to sort of send a message to the Iranians that we can do these things that they do to us too. We can do it to them too. We can describe them as terrorists. We can cause trouble for them. We can complain about them to the international authorities, and this is what they've done. But beyond that, I'm not sure how far this might go, although it has the potential of causing trouble in the sense that the international police, Interpol, will apparently, Iranians have taken it to the Interpol, and Interpol has to react to this. They said to us in the BBC Persian that they do not take action on issues that are political. But nevertheless, when you take things to Interpol, they stay there. They tend to stay on their books, kind of thing. It has a propaganda value for Iran, both internally and possibly outside. Many people outside Iran will think, oh, okay, good that Iran did this to Donald Trump.
But just to follow up on that, Pamela, I think it's a really interesting question. I know that Serbia issued lots of international arrest warrants for Kosovo Albanian politicians, and they would find themselves stopped at airports due to Serbian arrest warrants. So, it didn't matter that the French or the Swiss didn't know what the basis was for the Serbian arrest warrants, but it still meant that the Kosovo-Albanian politician would spend 48 hours in custody. And obviously the Serbs were very happy with that tactic. So if the Iranians managed to achieve the same thing, it'd be quite a significant achievement, I think. Diane Cook, please do stay on the line, everyone, because we love having these questions and it's good for the discussion later. So stay there. And if you've got more questions, please do come back. Diane Cook. Diane? Hello, Diane.
I'm trying to...
there we go.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
can you hear me?
Yes. Go
yes. On. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm always interested when you talk, when sanctions are imposed on countries, and there are many around the world, including Iran. How do, the depth of the trouble that they cause to the local population, how do ordinary people perceive those imposing the sanctions? Do they blame their government, or do they blame the person inflicting the pain on them?
Good question. Difficult to answer in the sense that it's not a straightforward question of what happens to you from a source outside the country. A lot of people have problems with what the Iranian authorities are doing internally to them. So my anecdotal sort of impression is that Iran is very much divided. We've got almost a third of people blaming the US for the sanctions and the impact of the sanctions on them. They blame it on the US. Another third blaming their own government and the regime for this. And another third basically blaming both sides, kind of thing. So it's not as clear cut as you might expect.
Right. Okay. That's so good question though. Let's Diane, do stay there. I think we can come back to that and explore that in a moment as well. Barbara Clark and then Simon. Let's take Barbara Clark and then Simon Jackson. We'll do two in a row. So Barbara, if you can speak.
Hello. Yes. My question is really going back to the harassment that you were talking about. How do you and your colleagues who are also receiving it, how do you deal with what must be the internal conflict between wanting to stand up to that regime, the people who are doing it, and wanting to continue to report, and your fears for your family?
It's a difficult one. We have to manage it, and we do the best we can, most of us. I've seen the situation in our newsroom. When you look at your colleagues and when we have meetings, we discuss these things. You can see that a lot of us are pretty traumatized, if you like. But at the same time, we are doing a thing. This is it's a job we have to do, and we love to do that, and we know how important it is, and we are continuing with it. Some of us who have had more pressure on them have left us, in fact. We've had a few of us, because of these pressures, who've left the BBC and the job altogether. But most of us are still there, and we seem to be continuing in spite of all this.
Kasra, do you have an idea of what impact you have within Iran? How many people get to see you, but also your sort of influence, the stories that you produce, and also what other sources do Iranians have from outside of Iran?
I said earlier before that people don't speak English, many Iranians, so the sources of news are limited, so they cannot listen, for example, watch CNN or BBC in English or anything. So the sources in Persian Within those range of sources, there are a few television channels broadcasting from abroad, but BBC by far is the most reliable. Probably in terms of numbers of people watching, the biggest. We're pretty big in Iran. We are, the last numbers we had a few years ago, something like 14 million people watching us regularly. This is way more than BBC One in Britain, for example, people watching BBC One in this country. So we are pretty big. And the reason for that is the widespread censorship in Iran, that people turn to the BBC for reliable news, and we provide that. And the Iranians are trying to stop that. They've been trying to interfere with the satellite transmissions, things like that. But we do get through via satellites and on the internet. So people do see us, and quite a lot of them. And yeah, we are probably the most reliable source of news in Persian to Iran.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let's go to Simon Jackson, and this relates to the nuclear deal. Roughly speaking, Iran had to stop nuclear uranium enrichment, and in return, sanctions would be lifted. That's very loosely it. And Jackson's question is about compliance. Simon.
Yeah, the Americans maintain that Iran is in breach of the agreement. The Iranians maintain they're in compliance. The Europeans seem broadly sympathetic to the Iranians. Is it possible to give a reasonably objective assessment as to where the truth may lie?
I try. This nuclear agreement, as you said, is based on the premise that you stop your nuclear program and nuclear activities to a great extent, and in return, the sanctions will be lifted. So that was the premise of the agreement, the nuclear agreement. And for a while it worked until Donald Trump withdrew from the deal and reimposed American sanctions, and then reimposed secondary sanctions, which means any company abroad, anybody dealing with Iran abroad will come under American sanctions itself. So that means most of the sanctions are back on Iran, and therefore...
Just to pick up on Simon's question, the question is, were the Iranians compliant? And your answer is yes, they were.
They were compliant as far as the agreement was concerned, but you could argue that Iranians didn't sort of live up to the spirit of the agreement. One of those things was, for example, Iran will not test ballistic missiles, which they seem to be doing it without calling it a ballistic missile, and so on and so forth, or Iranian activities in the region. Just 3 days before the nuclear agreement came into being in terms of being implemented, the Iranians went and arrested a whole bunch of American sailors in the Persian Gulf and caused trouble. And then the Revolutionary Guards. And then later they tested a missile with Hebrew signs on it saying that Israel has to be wiped off the face of the earth. All these provocations where you could argue that they are not compliant in the sense that they went against the spirit of the agreement. So,
Kasra, just to follow that up, is that an internal dispute? Is that the hardliners, the Revolutionary Guard versus the reformists? What was going on there?
Yes, it's the Revolutionary Guards, and we have President Rouhani on the record basically criticizing them, saying that this is no time to test these missiles and write on them with Hebrew words that Israel has to be wiped off the face of the earth.
I think that's the really important point, isn't it? That Iran is not a monolithic political system. It's a system with many parts, many competing parts, and it's painted by the Americans generally as though it is one sort of hardline bloc, and they try and sort of gloss over these competing elements. Jim Lernstein I want to bring in, and then Andy Mendes. Jim Lernstein, if you could just undo your mic, we should have you there ready to go. Jim, can you hear us? I'll just wait for a second to see if Jim can come online. Jim, you just got to go down to the microphone and unstick the microphone. We haven't spoken, Kasri, really about...
Okay, I'm unmuted.
You're there. Okay, great.
Okay.
Jim, you go ahead.
Well, I have a strange statement to make. As this program was starting, suddenly an announcement flashed on my screen saying this program is not supported. And there was a dismiss button, so I pushed this dismiss button. But I wondered if I had been hacked by the Iranians. I wondered whether anybody else had gotten this message. And I wonder what it means. Now, I do have a question in addition to the statement, which I must say I find very odd. And the question is, among the hardliners in Iran, are there any who understand the United States, who've been exposed to it, who've lived here? I mean, Zarif knows the United States intimately. There are Americans in the government who know Iran intimately. Is there anyone in the hardline leadership who knows anything about the United States or the West, for that matter?
Kasri.
The only person really is Zarif that he was educated in the U.S. He lived in U.S. for a while. He understands how the international system works. The problem
he was the foreign minister who famously got on so well with Kerry.
Yes, that's the one. No, the thing is that the Iranian, this is one of the issues, one of the problems with the Iranian regime as a whole, is that people who are in power don't really understand the international community, the international relations. They don't know how international relations works. They don't know how the UN works. What are the importance of, for example, UN sanctions or UN Security Council resolution or a resolution by the IAEA. Okay, over the last few years, since Iran has been dealing with a lot of these resolutions against it, they've come to understand them a little bit better. But on the whole, my view is that we have quite a deficit of understanding how the world works. Iranian leader, supreme leader, hasn't left the country for 40 years or something. Many of these people haven't traveled much. They don't know even our own region. They haven't traveled to Pakistan or Dubai or Kuwait or Turkey, for example, to see how other people are living, how are they doing. So there's quite a bit of deficit on that front.
I'm going to keep Andy Mendes's question, which is a fantastic question, in reserve. And I do want to ask Kasra about Iranian foreign policy, how it's managed to increase its influence in the region, particularly after the US intervention in Iraq, and then the civil war in Syria, and then, of course, from 2015 onwards, the conflict in Iran and relations with Yemen. So there's a lot there, but you could argue that Iran has really expanded its influence in the region, and that's really under the guise or under the hand of the hardliners.
Yes, and Qasem Soleimani, the general who was assassinated a few months back in Iraq, was the architect of all that. The thing is that the Iranians knew that they were coming under a lot of pressure from the West because of their nuclear activities, and with all those sanctions and resolutions at the UN and all that against Iran, things got a bit sort of tense in Iran, in the sense that in the Persian Gulf, for example, the chances of a war breaking out became more and more real and possible. And what Iranians could do at the time was that, okay, now that we are in this kind of pressure, we cannot confront the United States militarily or the Western powers. What we can do is to do what they call an asymmetric sort of a strategy of defense, in the sense that we can cause trouble for the Western powers, particularly the US, in localities where we have support, like in southern Lebanon, like in Syria, like in other places where there are supporters of Iran. And that became a policy.
It would be fair to say that Iran is now the most significant regional power in the Middle East? Beyond, I mean, I'm talking about within Iraq, within Syria.
Most significant power in the Middle East. How do you assess how big is your power? I suppose in terms of having influence to have influence and have military muscle in some of these places, yes, Iran is the only one that has that kind of thing. They have military muscle in Yemen, they have it in Iraq, they have it in Syria, they have it in southern Lebanon. And they are working on that, and they have been supporting that and strengthening those groups, armed groups in these countries to further this idea of projecting power and strengthening their defense regionally.
Yeah. We're coming now to Andy Mendis's question, which I love. But just to sort of preface it, Iranian-US elections and Iranian-US relations seem to be embedded in hostility, and that situation hasn't changed in 40 years. And that's a pretty unusual. It's almost like this is the Cold War. It's a sort of fixed point of international affairs. Andy, ask your question.
So you want the US question, not the BBC question?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, the question was short, which says, did the US start hating Iran before Iran started hating America, or was it the other way around? Because I go back long enough to remember the empire, the axis of eagle, and George Bush, God bless him, who now seems quite liberal and tolerant. But where did it start, or was it inevitable as soon as the Shah got ousted?
It started with the revolution, with the ousting of the Shah and the occupation, if you like, of the American embassy in Tehran, taking of hostages. So that was the beginning of this terrible sort of a path that Iran found itself on with the US. And we're still on that path, and we're still further away from getting back to the straight and narrow, if you like, and things are getting even worse with this present US administration, with this policy of maximum pressure. So things don't look too good on that front.
Yeah. So there was that gap that you talked about earlier when John Kerry and Obama were actually, in my mind, saying sensible things, and there seemed to be an accommodation. Do you think, no offense to my American friends, God willing, Donald Trump loses in November and Biden comes in, do you think that there's a chance that we can get back to that sort of constructive relationship?
We could go back to where we were before Donald Trump withdrew from the nuclear agreement, I suppose. But it may not happen immediately. There's quite a bit of baggage that we seem to have picked up since then between the two countries and relations of the two countries. So, but certainly a lot of people are putting their hopes in that, both in America and in Iran, that with the new administration, we might get away from this particular path that we're on.
I'm just looking at the panel of attendees, and there are lots of people who I know have spent a lot of time in Iran and know Iran very well. So please do chip in if you're one of those, and I think some of you know who I'm talking about. So please do, if you've got a question or you've got any thoughts, please do chip in. what was I going to say? But we didn't actually answer Jim Lernstein's question. I don't know if you know about this, Kasra, but Zoom is very sensitive about US sanctions. So if you are in Cuba, for example, you can't use Zoom from Cuba. You have to use you have to go around a different way to, you have to use a virtual private network.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's the same in Iran, and I don't know whether Zoom was being overly sensitive, Jim, but that's the only way I can think about why that message appeared on your computer. But I don't think anyone's hacked it. I don't think anyone's going to know about this. I hope not. Anyway, is going to know about this briefing.
It's the first time I hear about this Zoom complication.
Right. I don't know if it applies. I would be surprised if you can access Zoom in Iran, but maybe others know about that. I don't know. It's certainly the case in Cuba. You can't use it. Do you have a sense now of what's happening with the economy, Kasra, in Iran at the moment? Do you have a sense of how difficult it is to get day-to-day goods? What inflation's like? What are the kind of troubles that people face due to sanctions at the moment?
It's getting really difficult for people to make ends meet. And the pressure is pretty devastating on Iranian economy. The fact is not much money coming in. Iran cannot sell oil at all, in fact. So Iran is in a terrible situation to pay for its ways for the moment in terms of paying salaries and imports, the basic imports that it needs. It's in a difficult position, and that's the reason why the value of the Iranian rial is almost in a free fall these days. It has lost its 30% of its values only in the last 3 or 4 weeks. 3 weeks, possibly. And since Rouhani came to power, some 85% of the value is gone. And that sort of has a knock-on effect on everything in Iran, the transport, the food, anything that comes from abroad or anything that is manufactured in Iran has imported elements in it. All that affects everything in terms of prices, everyday prices for food, and that sort of, it shows. I mean, if the money in your pocket loses 30% of its value in 3 weeks, that's pretty devastating.
Yeah. There's a good sort of follow-up question here. We've got an anonymous question here. The question's about the bazaars, and you talked about the money markets. If you go to the central bazaar in Tehran, you can actually see a live money markets for people. You can see the rate of exchange for the Iranian rial going up and down. It's actually quite fun to see. The question here is that the bazaris used to be very powerful. Are they still, and which way are they leaning, Kasra?
I'm not sure whether they are as powerful as they used to be pre-revolution and in the early years of the revolution. I think a lot of the economy is now state economy, is run by various state actors, and the bazaar's role is diminished pretty much. But nevertheless, bazaris are bazaris. Business people are business people. Business people always sort of mostly seem to go with the way that the wind blows, in the sense, in terms of economy, in terms of the politics of the country. And for the moment, I don't see any signs of particular resistance from the bazaris in Iran to what's going on in Iran. So yeah, not as powerful as they used to be.
Right, okay. Marty, just going back to your second question now, and that relates to water.
Water.
It's a good question.
Yeah. When I was in Iran, our guide told us that the country had used 80% of its fresh water in the last 40 years. and that it didn't appear as though the government was really starting to pay any attention to how they were going to desalinate or whatever. Do you know where that stands at this point?
I don't have any expert knowledge of that. What I understand is that we've had on and off for the last 23, 24 years droughts in Iran. And that has sapped a lot of water resources in the country, up and down the country, everywhere almost. And that has led to drying of rivers, drying of lakes, you name it. In the last year and a half, things seem to be changing. There's more rain in Iran, and the lakes are sort of filling up again. Some rivers that had been dry are, they filled up with water now, and you got running water through them. So things are looking better compared to before in terms of water shortages. But I think the shortages are not quite gone yet. I suppose you need another 3 or 4 or 5 years of this kind of rain, annual rain that we've had in the last year or two, to be able to go back to where we were before. And in terms of what happens underground water resources and sources, I have no idea. You have to talk to somebody who's an expert in that kind of thing.
Okay. I've got 2 questions on foreign policy, and then I want to come to Pamela Dixon. But firstly, Kasra, what's the situation with Syria? Iran ostensibly in a very powerful position in the sort of influence and what happens now. Does that hold challenges with it? So I'll deal with that one first, and then I've got a question about Yemen. So first of all, on Syria, what's Iran's opportunities and disadvantages at the moment there?
Since the beginning of the civil war in Syria, 2011, Iran sided with Bashar Assad. And they sided with him because they want access to Lebanon, and Syria was one of the few Arab countries who helped Iran during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. So they paid back in a sense, and then Syria was a bridge to Lebanon. They had to make sure that that bridge keeps open. So they sided with Bashar Assad. It cost them a lot in terms of money and blood. A lot of Iranians were killed. Iranian prestige in the area suffered for it because they sided with Bashar Assad. Within Syria, Iranians became pretty unpopular with the normal, ordinary Syrians, save for supporters of Bashar Assad. And then the Russians came, and then Iran and Russia became on the same, they became closely involved with each other in Syria. Today, things there seem to be some tension there between Russia and Iran on the issue of Syria. I don't know where that is heading to. For the moment, Bashar Assad's economic situation is getting as bad as things are in Iran, which is not good news for him, nor for Iran, because I don't know how Iran could possibly help Syrians in terms of their economy, given the fact that Iranian economy itself is going through the floor. But then also Iran is accused of meddling in the affairs of other countries in the region. They are close to Israel there, and Israel has taken the policy of making sure that Iran cannot have a foothold near its borders. So you get reports frequently these days that Israeli airplanes are attacking various targets in Syria that are basically Iranian targets there. So that is still
Which in
going
turn
on.
raises the prospect of conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. And in a way, it's amazing that hasn't happened throughout this process.
Yeah, they've been trying to avoid that. I mean, there is a policy with Hezbollah and Israel that, okay, we go up to a point, but no further so far. And so far that policy is held, and there hasn't been any sort of skirmishes on the border of southern Lebanon and Israel recently. Nothing serious anyway. Right.
I'm going to ask, we'll get Pamela Dixon's question, and then I want to ask about Yemen, and then I'm afraid we have to let you go after that. But let's go to Pamela's question first.
Yes, I was curious about the recent military satellite launch in April that Iran pulled off, because number one, there's only 10 or 11 other countries that have successfully launched satellites. And number two, one hears all the time about the brain drain in Iran. So what does it say about the technological and scientific might or abilities of Iran to have been able to do this?
Good question. As far as military technology is concerned, Iranians and this particular regime and the Iranian leaders are putting a lot of resources into that. Because they cannot buy weapons from abroad, they are sanctioned on that front. They are trying to produce as much themselves as possible. On the missile front, they have been very successful. And they started doing this from the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq war, when they were under severe pressure from the Iraqis, because Iraqis had as much missiles as they wanted in their country, and Iranians didn't have any. So they started this whole program on building missiles. They've been very successful. And this satellite launch is basically attached to that program. That is an extension of their successes in terms of building missiles. And these missiles are questionable now because they are technically the sort of missiles that you use for producing ballistic missiles, the technology of it. So that's sensitive on that front. But they have managed to throw things into the space. I'm not sure what they actually placed in space is something that you can actually call a satellite as such. I don't have reliable information whether what they put out into space is any use to them in terms of communication or anything. But obviously they've taken the first steps and they are halfway there.
The war in Yemen has produced a terrible death toll, huge amounts of bombing from Saudi Arabia, the Houthi rebels holding out strong. Houthi missile attacks are on Saudi Arabia, including the oil facilities there. What can you just give us a brief update? What's happening there, and is there a prospect of some kind of agreement and some kind of the Saudis pulling back a bit?
Every now and then there are signs that things are looking good. There's a UN mission to, to bring the two sides together, and then after a while nothing comes of it, and then you hear that the Saudis are going to pull back, they're not going to fight anymore, and then sort of a few weeks later it's a reverse of what we see, and so on and so forth. This war started with the Iranians' involvement in support of Houthis, started in 2015, still going on. I don't see any sign of this sort of ending anytime soon, although there are some, obviously, diplomatic activities afoot to bring the two sides together and the war. But I haven't seen anything that leads me to be optimistic. And obviously, Houthis in Yemen are becoming more useful to the Iranians vis-a-vis the Saudis. They in a sense, Iranians are fighting a proxy war with the Saudis on that front, and they have managed to get across to Yemen and to the Houthis these missiles that they are firing at Saudi Arabia, quite a serious nuisance for the Saudis. And it looks as if Saudis can't stop that. So, yeah, it's a proxy war as well as a civil war going on.
Kasra, we've got a final question here. I mean, I look at the BBC for news on Iran, but that doesn't give me access to all the reporting that the Persian service is doing. A limited amount of it comes onto the English language website of the BBC. What can you recommend if you want to follow what's going on in Iran more closely? What are there some websites that you recommend?
Websites in English.
I've put you on the spot there.
Yeah, I can't think of anything that is, as you say, the BBC Persian has got a very good website, but it's in Persian. The rest of the BBC doesn't need to know that sort of depth of detail on Iran. So that's why only when the story is big that the stories get translated and put on the English service. Beyond that, not really. I don't have any one particular website that I regularly go to. I've got a host of people that I look at to get my information and to sort of keep abreast.
Yeah. Well, it's been a great pleasure talking to you here. Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.
It's been a fantastic discussion.